Name is Dale Iverson, served in the U.S. Navy, went in as enlisted, retired as a commander, and had a very good career. When I was 5 years old, it would have been 1941, Minneapolis had Air Force airplanes. They came out over our farm and they flew their combat training. And so that was my first interest in wanting to be an aviator. And at the age of 12, I was in our small town, and the son of one of the merchants flew a Navy Corsair F-4 down through Main Street and blew the leaves off the trees. And I determined that I wanted to fly in the Navy at that age. I've flown about 24 different types of airplanes in the Navy. In Vietnam, the primary one was the A-4 Skyhawk and the Corsair II, which was the A-7. So those were the two airplanes in combat. I've flown in the test pilot school. I flew everything from powered gliders to helicopters. So had quite a variant of experience. The Skyhawk was a very small attack aircraft, but it was predominantly designed initially for carrying nuclear weapons. Had long landing gear, and it would take a 30-inch bomb underneath it. So our first training was in delivery of nuke weapons. It transitioned through the years with the change of the world situation to an attack aircraft that carried bombs and fired guns and was an extremely maneuverable airplane. You were literally a part of the airplane. The sensitivity of the airplane were such that if you turned sideways and leaned, the aircraft would lean.
Wow.
It was just a remarkable airplane.
Mm-hmm.
My first cruise for Vietnam was on the Intrepid, and we left the States in June, and our first combat was in July 24th, I believe. You hear about Vietnam. I was in pilot training for teaching other people how to fly and ground school and everything else. So we had always knew there was a Vietnam. I think my initial idea of Vietnam was that it was a conflict, it wasn't a war. I guess with all the training we received, it was our responsibility to pay for that by doing the service the military wanted us to do. Tonkin Gulf, as my understanding of history of that, there was a mistake. We thought we were being attacked, we weren't, and so we created an attack. And at that particular time, the talking heads in Washington couldn't figure out the time difference between Saigon and Washington, and so they announced the first strike an hour before it happened. And so obviously it gave the Vietnamese of North Vietnam the great opportunity to engage the airplanes that came in. Typical, I think, of the politicians running a war and not the military. I'm not really sure. I guess we were protecting the French plantations. I never really understood what the purpose of, like I said, it was a conflict, wasn't a war, and the conflict started with bad judgment, and it continued throughout the entire time with bad judgment. McNamara, Westmoreland being from Spartanburg, but Westmoreland thrived on body count. At the end of all debriefing, the question out of the intel community is, how many did you think you killed? The only thing good that came out of Vietnam was Schwarzenbach, because he worked for Westmoreland and he saw what incompetence was. So when he did the Iraq war, freedom there, he did it right. Yeah, I don't want to, just don't want to appear as if there's a bitterness about it. Mm-hmm. We work at the pleasure of the President of the United States, and the President had appointed McNamara, and our targets were limited to what the civilians wanted us to hit, and consequently we neglected hitting a lot of the targets that could have ended the conflict. A 500-pound bomb makes a really big swimming pool, and that's about what we did. We made a lot of swimming pools, destroyed lots of bridges, which were put up again the next day. So it was frustrating. There was a church that was a beautifully big Catholic church. I think there were 8 spirals. It was gorgeous. It sat looking out over the Tonkin Gulf. And that was used to store weapons in. And you could see the trucks going in, loading it, keeping them there, the trucks going out. That church was finally struck on the last day that we were up in North Vietnam. And we were 90 miles away on an aircraft carrier, and for 2 days you could see the smoke coming up.
So that was the North Vietnamese?
North Vietnamese, and it was ammo, huge ammo storage for all the stuff they got out of China. 1968, okay. July 24th, it was the San Dung Highway Bridge. And we struck it in broad daylight the first day, and a good strike, effective, knocked the bridge out. And that was our first shot. After that, we flew basically every day. You would get one flight in. We would operate 7 days from, say, noon to midnight. And then the next 7, we'd go from midnight to noon. And so half our involvement was at night. The effectiveness at night was obviously poor. It was more harassment than it was any effectiveness. And again, we didn't have the type of targets that were the ones that should have been struck. I think primarily it was interdiction, the idea of stopping a supply of weapons going to South Vietnam. We actually left the line in the end of December. Yeah, 26 December was the end of our period. First strike was end of July, and the last one was 26 December. and predominantly interdiction. To the south, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the various other things, it was all trying to stop flow of traffic going south. Mm-hmm. On the average, I would say that we flew 2 flights on one day, and the next day would be 1. And we would do that for a 7-day period, and then, like I said, we would switch to the other part of the day. And we stayed on the line probably 4 weeks and then go into port and have a week or so of that, and then back out again. I think my total flight in the military was something over 4,000. I describe hours and hours of boredom interrupted by moments of stark terror. The night was bad because you could see the tracers and you could not see the SAMs, the surface-to-air missile. All you would see is their light off of the ground, and then you just hope that your electronics and your eyeball will be astute enough to avoid it. And it would be scary because sometimes to avoid, you end up down in the mountain range and, you're going to get hit by a surface to air or ground fire or fly into the mountain. So it was very much harassing for the pilot at night. Mm-hmm. Daytime, you got to see what was going on, so not as big a problem. You always think it's going to happen to the other guy, and if I do the right things, I can avoid it. But the idea of being a POW was not. The one period of time that bothered me is I'd had dental work done, and I had a metal cap on my tooth, and I thought, man, if I get shot down, that's really going to be a painful part of my existence. Stupid thinking, Yeah. The least of my worries should be a tooth versus bodily harm. But anyway, you always feel that you're probably, it's the other guy it happens to.
Mm-hmm. Talking about POWs, so you had mentioned that you knew John McCain.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned that you had actually trained him.
John McCain was involved in the forest hall in the fire that was there. There was 135 people, I think, that were killed when a rocket went off and struck another aircraft, and the whole thing caught on fire. John McCain got away from that. His hands were burned, and he got back to the States, and he was in the training squadron that I was a instructor pilot in. And so I had several occasions to fly with him. I had expressed that John McCain was a dangerous pilot, and I suggested to him, with his influence of his dad as being an admiral, that he transfer to submarines or surface warfare, because I didn't think he was competent as an aviator.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And within a month of those words of wisdom, he got shot down.
And then he was there. He was a POW until after
6 years.
6 years. Yeah.
6 years, and there's a lot of witnesses that said that John was not an ideal prisoner, but You know, that's personal. How do you handle yourself when your arms are broke and you're hanging by your feet from the ceiling? He bore an awful lot of abuse. And I think something that helped him was that they knew that he was the son of an admiral, grandson of an admiral, and that probably gave him a little bit of treatment that others might not have gotten. So he lived through it. If the military had run the target list, I think we could have stopped them. And I think we could have interdicted supplies at the China border and not between North and South Vietnam. And whether or not it would have changed anything, I don't know. But the fact is, there were targets that were absolutely would have been devastating to North Vietnam to have struck, and it would have changed their ability to be offensive against airplanes in the air and everything, and we just didn't strike them. The target list made up in Washington, D.C.
So it sounds like the military was listening more to the politicians than the...
Yeah, like I say, it started off that way. I mean, it was a French... my understanding was it was the French plantations, and instead of just leaving it to them, we got involved in trying to preserve them. You train and train and train in the military, and your duty is to execute the commands of the commander-in-chief. And now, I wouldn't have done anything different. I would have still been obedient to the rules and regulations, and yeah, you grumble against them, but you do what you're trained to do. We were very fortunate. At the end of our tour over there, 126 of the pilots on the Intrepid from all of the different squadrons were flown back to the U.S., and the ship and the rest of probably 600 other aviators stayed on the ship and drove it all the way back to U.S. We flew into San Francisco, and we couldn't come in uniform because of the harassment that people were getting that were in uniform. And to me, it was, you know, how stupid can you get 126 people come off an airplane into LA? They're all suntanned and all in the age category of 24 to 30, and you don't think that that's unusual? Mm-hmm. But the protesters were there. They were protesting our baby killing and all the other stuff that they said we did. So, not a good welcome. Never did have a good welcome. Vietnam was, I mean, it was a duty required, duty adhered to, duty performed. Mm-hmm. The ridiculousness of politicians running the war is the same today as it was then. You know, why else would we not be hitting the source of the material rather than the user of the material in Iran? Mm-hmm. So nothing's changed. It's still politicians.
So then on your journal you have written a conflict, not a war. Was that like an idea a lot of people shared?
I mean, I wrote that in before I even started the journal. Because, I mean, it was just evident of the nature, the way things were run. That, it was costly for the U.S. military. My first fleet flying off the aircraft carrier, there were 19 pilots in our command, in our squadron. When I finished the Navy in '78, going back and looking at how many of those 19 were still alive, only 9. All the rest had died in either Vietnam or aircraft accidents. So attrition was a lot higher than on the overall. Not all of them. One of them had gone into airlines and got recalled as a reservist on an airline, and he flew into the back end of a ship on his caracols qualification. So I mean, the mistakes were not just Vietnam. The mistakes were pilot given. Equipment, no. Generally speaking, our equipment was not the cause of accidents. People were.
I believe you had mentioned that you were there during the evacuation.
Yeah, I had gotten transferred to the Enterprise to an attack squadron flying A-7s, and I'd gotten transferred there, and so I was part of the first flight to go back over, and this time we were going over to Saigon to help to protect the evacuation. And so that was the last mission that we had over there. Unfortunately, we lost one of our aircraft, our squadron, on that mission. We believe that he was hit by some anti-aircraft fire, and he got out to sea, and he had to get out of the airplane. So we did lose an airplane on almost the last day of the Vietnam conflict.
Mm-hmm.
What a shame.
Yeah.
Because again, we didn't do anything. The evacuation was going. We carried a lot of bombs. There was no one to drop it on, and so we dropped them back out in the ocean. I was brought up in a Lutheran church, and I attended with my parents. Every time the doors were open, we were there. It wasn't until probably, many years later that I come to understand who Christ was. And in actuality, during that time in Vietnam, I carried in my flight suit a Bible with me at all times. I had a Bible over in one pocket, and on the other side, I had a automatic weapon. And the idea being, I guess, if I get captured, I'd throw the gun to them so I can show I'm friendly, because I'm not about to take on people. And hopefully they would allow me to keep the Bible. My relationship was one of knowing who Christ was, only loosely speaking. I hadn't personally accepted him as my Savior. I was well aware of the fact that everything good about me was because I was good, not because of salvation. Kind of a lost sort of a person. I look back and think, wow, I was so fortunate to not be put in a position where I had to rely on myself for faith and understanding. It was actually 1975, so it would have been 8 years, 7, 8 years after Vietnam, that I come to a full understanding of what the significance was of a triune God whose blood sacrifice purchased my eternity at his right hand. And I think the first time I ever really had a strong understanding of that is I was having to go back onto carrier qualification again. I was getting ready to deploy with another squadron, and I had to go on out and get my landing on the carrier and meet my proficiency requirement. And our little church in California had really taken on a desire to pray for me. And that, I think, was the first time that I ever really was aware of the fact that God's hand was upon me in a very significant way, that he was my strength and not myself. I had one of the best carrier qualification periods. I had 6 landings at night, straight, shot off, come around, land, shot off, no mistakes, no errors, no nothing, and I just felt like I was under his hand the whole time. Very, very interesting feeling to have such an absolute assurance of presence.